I'm going to talk to you about a problem that probably you've all been touched by. Stroke is a disorder, the most common neurological disorder. It's the leading cause of disability in the United States. Somebody's having a stroke every 40 seconds in the United States. Somebody's dying every 4 minutes. And the problem is that despite the enormity of the problem, and another statistic is, after the age of 65, 1 in 5 women, 1 in 6 men will have a stroke. And we don't have anything to do for the brain injury if you survive the stroke, and we're getting better and better at helping people survive the stroke, but we don't have treatments to try and repair the brain afterwards. And I'm going to try and talk to you about how we might be able to change that and why we've reached this impasse. Okay. So if you look up on the screens, BLAM stands for, in case you're wondering, the Brain Learning, Animation, and Movement Lab at Johns Hopkins that I'm director of. The Japanese calligraphy dolphin in between is the symbol for a group we formed called KATA, which you'll hear more about, which is an unusual group within our lab that I co-founded, where we try and bring engineering in software and hardware to bear on human medical problems. I mean, one thing that you'll hear a lot about today is that we need to do human-based research in medicine. I think the way that you all see it on the television or hear about it is mice and genes and molecules and test tubes and petri dishes. But in fact, if we're going to advance, we need to do research in humans as well, and there are technologies and approaches that need to be brought to bear on human research. So I'm making a plug for those of you who wish to support medical research. Please understand that doing work in humans is vitally important, and it's not just what you consider basic research, which is genes and molecules and drugs. And then there's a symbol for Johns Hopkins, where I am on the side. This is our website. You can go there to find all the publications and all the work we're doing, description of all the people. What you see there is actually a rendition by a full-time artist that we have in the lab. You'll hear more about her later. And then you see the old Johns Hopkins in the red brick, and then the new Johns Hopkins on the right. They not quite organized like that, but it's artistic license. And most importantly for any lab, follow us on Twitter. All right? All right, so these are 10 patients. These are MRIs using a particular technique called diffusion-weighted imaging. These are slices through the brain, anterior, posterior. So the nose is pointing upward in all these brains. And all I'm showing you here are 10 patients, all who've had strokes. The bright white is where the stroke is. All you need to know is that bright white represents death of tissue along the tract from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord to control the limb on the opposite side. And all these patients, these are real patients in a database that I set up at Columbia, are completely paralyzed down the opposite side. So there are two questions immediately. Is there any way to predict whom of those 10 will get better, if any? And if you can predict their trajectories, is there any way that you can change those trajectories? Okay. Now, unfortunately, this is another rendition by Kat McNally, the artist in the lab. If you do have the misfortune of having a stroke, you will end up in a hospital bed, and hospitals pride themselves now on essentially making your room private. They seem to be more inspired by hotels than actually patient care. And you will spend, there are data, about 60% of your time utterly alone in your room, and you'll spend about 85% of the time immobile. Right? And here you see somebody just sitting there watching the Weather Channel. And I think Texas is very hot and red. I never noticed that before. Right? Anyway, so you're going to hear from me now why spending your time largely alone and immobile in your expensive private room is an utter disaster when it comes to brain injury. Okay? Now, there's not going to be lots of math and science here. I'm just going to show you some just to get the message across. Don't worry. But we discovered back in 2008 that there was a predictable endogenous degree of recovery that every patient undergoes after brain injury. It's a little bit like a bruise or a cut. These are healing processes that are triggered by the injury to the tissue, and they do it on their own. And that's true of stroke as well. The vast majority of people will make some improvement after stroke. The question is, why? And are we allowed to get any of the credit for this recovery that happens early on after stroke? And the problem is that the answer is no. Okay, this is something, and you can go back to the history of medicine where your doctor was really there to sort of hold your hand and hope that you did well. Heart attacks, for example, in the 60s, you'd be wheeled into a room, the door would be closed, the curtains would be drawn, and like a migraine, one just hoped that you got better. Right? And that's very much what happens after stroke, unfortunately, despite what you may think. And this mathematical rule simply says what is the actual property of this spontaneous biological recovery that happens after stroke. And it's quite predictable, surprisingly, despite you can have a stroke at different ages and different locations. Interestingly enough, the properties of the recovery are similar across the range of severity, and you get about 70% back of what you maximally could get back after your stroke, with the exception of a group of severely paralyzed patients where a subset of those don't seem to follow this rule. Now, this rule was good to discover because it meant there were processes that were endogenous, that were triggered by the stroke, that we could perhaps exploit, piggyback on, or even amplify. Okay. And also, in imaging studies we've done, you can actually see these are MRIs, functional MRIs, where you can actually look at patterns of activation of the brain during behavior. And this was a study we did a while ago, simply showing that there was a predictable pattern of activation in the brain that seemed to maybe be the neural correlate of this proportional recovery rule, where you get about 70% back of what you lost. So again, it's quite good because you may be able to identify it, you may be able to intervene both behaviorally, pharmacologically, and ultimately maybe even into the brain itself, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, why am I talking about not being alone in the hospital room? Why am I talking about the importance of going in early? Well, because unfortunately, most patients are obviously going to pass through this period of time quite quickly, and then they become chronic patients. And what's a chronic stroke patient? We use the term chronic for anyone who's 6 months out after their stroke. Most of the research on new ways to repair the brain after stroke and other forms of injury happens in this period. First of all, the patients are much easier to get hold of. They're not going through their acute illness. And also, there's not a moving target. They've finished recovering is the idea, and so anything that changes, you can get full credit for. All right? Because it's not you trying to see signal behind that spontaneous recovery process I was telling you about. Okay? So if you read the Times and other places, you're going to hear about stem cells, you'll hear about robots, you'll hear about brain stimulation, you'll hear about constraint-induced therapy. Most of these studies are being done late, and unfortunately, none of them do very much. All right? And I'm going to show you just how we go about looking to see whether we can do much to repair the brain once you've gone beyond this period of the first weeks and months after your brain injury. All right? So this is basically a kind of apparatus, and this is what I mean by human-based research. We've got ways now to quantify and measure human behavior quite well. And this is essentially an air hockey table. You sit at this table, and you are strapped into a chair, and your arm is held so that your elbow and shoulder are in a plane. And you basically are asked to simply make pointing movements on this air sled to remove the effects of friction, and also you're being held so that gravity is eliminated. So minimal friction, minimal weight, and now all you need to do is to aim to those targets, arrayed in a circle, and make straight, fast, accurate movements to them. All of you in this room would look like those colored lines that I'm showing you there. You'd all do pretty well with nice, straight movements to the targets. All right. And what do we use this for? This is a measurement of the quality of your motor control when you don't have to be strong and you don't have to fight friction. We're just looking at the quality of your movements. So there you are on the left if you haven't suffered brain injury, and there on the right you can see somebody who after a stroke, they cannot make smooth, straight, low variability, accurate movements. And of course the question is, can you get back from the stroke side back to the healthy side? Now, most rehabilitation is not aiming to make you go back to the way you were. What they're trying to do, and the average length of stay in rehabilitation is about 12 days. It's constantly going down. And why? Strictly for economic reasons. All right? We do not want to pay for long-term rehabilitation. All right? And we'll talk more about that later. So what do they try and make you do when you go to rehab? They try and help you compensate and cope with what you have left. So if you happen to lose your right arm and you're right-handed, you'll learn how to write with your left hand. You'll have a quad cane. You'll have a walker. You'll learn how to transfer out of bed to chair. You'll learn how to toilet safely. These are all important things, but these are coping mechanisms to get you out of the hospital as soon as possible, not an attempt to make you go back to normal neural functioning. It's extremely important that you get that across. When you send your loved ones or you go yourself to rehabilitation, they are not attempting to rewire your brain or reverse the injury. They're simply trying to teach you how to cope with what you have left. No different than if you lost your hand and had a hook on the end of it, like Captain Hook in Peter Pan becomes very adept with the hook. The hand doesn't grow back. All right? Now, one of the most exciting developments in rehabilitation was a trial that was published a number of years ago that looked at something called constraint-induced therapy. Now, has anyone ever heard about what constraint-induced movement therapy is here? So what you do there, and it was based on studies done in the 70s on monkeys that had had their sensation removed by severing the dorsal root ganglion, which is basically all the incoming sensory traffic goes away. And so even though you have normal strength and control in your limb, you no longer can feel where your limb is in space. And interestingly enough, monkeys, even though they had normal motor output, stopped using the limb. They couldn't feel it, they stopped using it. And then what they found in these studies was that if you tied up the good arm of the monkey and started to train it, it began to discover that it could still use this numb arm. Is that clear? So they basically thought, maybe we could translate this finding in monkeys to humans and take a patient after stroke, tie up their good arm, forcing them, therefore, to spend most of their time trying to get back function in their other arm. Okay? And the classic, original version of this was to do 2 weeks where you were trying to spend most of the day in a mitt or in a sling with your good arm 90% of the time, and then you had about 6 hours of treatment with your unaffected side. Okay? And this was the first large clinical trial done, multi-site, single-blinded trial in rehabilitation. It's published in JAMA. So the question is how did the people get better? Because they did. They reported an improvement. But when you report improvements in clinical trials, your improvement index is what matters. What are you actually measuring? All right? So for example, if quality of handwriting were your outcome measurement, and I started to become really good with my left hand to write, and I passed you the piece of paper, you go, look how much better his handwriting's gotten, and my arm that I used to use hasn't recovered one jot. But the measurement wasn't the right arm, it was handwriting, a distal functional measure. So the closer you get to the actual affected limb, the closer you're going to get to repair, whereas the more distal you get, the more you're looking at compensation and just new ways of doing things. So for example, if I want to reach for something on this podium, the normal way would be to extend at the elbow and rotate at the shoulder, but if I just keep my arm still and go like this and use my whole trunk to scoop, on some measure of speed of moving the object, you'd say I've improved, but of course I've just found a brand new way to do it with no improvement whatsoever at the elbow and shoulder. Okay? So the question then is you can call improvement in a clinical trial and after brain injury depending on the measure that you choose. And in the clinical trial on constraint-induced therapy, if you asked, there was one measure, which was a questionnaire, do you feel like you're coping at home better? Right? That got the best score. Then they had functional compensation scores, and that got the second best score. But the suspicion I had is when you got to a kind of test that I just showed you, where there's no way to cheat, your trunk is held, your arm is now going to only have one solution to make a straight movement, because there's only one way that you can make a straight movement when your elbow and shoulder are level, then you're not going to see it. And sure enough, we did a study where when you look at your ability to do motor control after this kind of therapy, it doesn't budge. And these are basically traces of people making movements in that apparatus I showed you before. And despite improvements on functional scales, which reproduced the result of the trial, when you were strict and looked at the quality of your movements, they didn't budge at all. Okay, so that's important because it makes the point once again that true reversal of injury is not what's happening with these kinds of treatment. All right. Robotics is another very big field now, rehabilitation robotics. And when we say robot, we don't mean literally a walking robot. We're talking about some kind of exoskeletal support, something that's going to assist you in making your movements. So this is just one of many robots. This is one that we studied, which is a three-dimensional assistive robot. And again, people have done trials with robots in patients with chronic stroke. And once again, they've reported small effect sizes. So the question you should all be asking yourself is, how are the robots making you better? Is it like the case of tying up the other arm? You're just finding new ways to get the job done? Or is it actually making a little bit of a dent in the real motor control problem? Well, it turns out that in the study that we did, and it's consistent with some others, it looks like you get a tiny, tiny real improvement in the quality of your movements when you have a robotic treatment rather than a constraint-induced therapy treatment. So small functional benefit with some treatments, maybe a microscopically small benefit in the direction we want with robots. But the bottom line is that these new treatments, like conventional physical therapy and occupational therapy, are not having much of an impact, if at all, in reversing your injury, and they have a spectrum of effectiveness when it comes to simply teaching you coping skills. Right? So we wanted to take another look. We wanted to sort of look at the early period, this period where some endogenous recovery is going on, and see whether we could learn about it and maybe then do something about it to sort of break this curse of lack of responsiveness either on the wards or in the chronic state. All right. So basically, there's, the labor of love. This is a study where we took patients from the time they had their stroke and then looked at them at various time points after their stroke up to a year out, and we basically threw the kitchen sink at them. We did brain imaging, structural imaging, brain stimulation, behavioral measures. We really just wanted to see what is going on in human beings as they progress through recovery from a stroke. All right. And this was a study that we did at Johns Hopkins, we did it at Columbia in New York, and we did it at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. Why Switzerland, you may ask, other than it's nice to go there? It's because actually a colleague of mine, Andy Luft, who's a well-known stroke neurologist and studies plasticity in rodents, is based there, and we wanted to have quite well-trained teams to carry off this kind of research. That's another one of the problems with this kind of research is you need a very large team of people, neuroscientists, neurologists, therapists, engineers, roboticists. It's one of the reasons why we've made so little progress in brain injury is because you need a different kind of team, and most research is take a pill once a day, let's see what the outcome is. All right? But this isn't pharmacological, this is behavioral intervention. This is like going to Juilliard for 4 years to learn the violin. You can't just pop a pill or put on some goggles, Matrix-like, and be a violin player in an hour. All right? So it's a real culture change. Is when it comes to brain injury, you need a lot more time with a lot more people with a lot more technologies, and it's not getting funded because we still have this obsession that there'll be a drug or a stem cell or something like having your appendix whipped out. It will just be done quickly. We don't have the patience to send our patients to college. All right. So this is just showing you again the picture I showed you, and I just want to tell you that you can mathematically quantify the quality of those trajectories, that all of you with your eyeballs can immediately see that the stroke patient is worse. But you need to find a way to actually turn that into a number, and you can do that. We don't have to go into details about that. And then you can plot that number across time. And all I want you to see here, and if I had my pointer, maybe I will actually venture out without falling over. So essentially, you've got different plots here. In the upper left-hand corner, you see function improving across time. And on the x-axis, it's basically just a year. And then on the y-axis is the score. The higher, the better. And you see the most of the jump is happening in the first 4 weeks. But you see that you're still getting some time. And even at 6 months, you're still improving. Okay? And then on the right, it's a slightly more detailed score about your ability to isolate your joints, and that too is following a very similar time course where most of the jump is early, but you're still eking out some benefit in the chronic state. All right? Now if you look on the x-axis, which is 2 numbers that quantify the quality of those trajectories on that motor control apparatus I showed you, and unfortunately you flatline within 4 or 5 weeks. Okay, so when it comes to a measure that we think is a measure of true repair, it's over within a month. Now remember what I told you when I started. You're alone 60% of the time, not moving 85% of the time, precisely in the window where all the repair's happening. So we are doing exactly the wrong thing in this time window. All right? Because even when you go to acute rehabilitation, there are 24 hours in the day. You get 1 hour of occupational therapy. You get 1 hour of physical therapy. You get 1 hour of speech. If you actually calculate out how much time you're actually moving, it turns out to be about 2/3 of that time. And when you count the number of movements you're making, it's pitifully small. Maybe 7 to 11 movements of any particular kind, maybe 20. Right? But we know from primate and rodent work, to have any actual change in the brain through movement, you need about 400 movements. Right? So these are homeopathic doses of therapy. Right? Now, you should all be asking yourself, why are you tolerating this? Right? The single biggest cause of disability in this country. Right? And yet, I would venture that most people don't even know about this epidemic in their midst. Right? You see these gleaming new hospitals, hundreds of millions are donated to them, and you go in and it's positively medieval. All right? We also track the hand. Okay? So this is an apparatus that we built with our colleagues in London, and this is actually a device which actually allows you to quantify the quality of your individuation. In other words, something that you lose after stroke all the time is you lose the ability to control the digits individually. You can just make strong grips. All right? And so this apparatus allows you to actually quantify how well. So all of you try now in the audience. All of you should try and move your ring finger up with all your other fingers keeping still. It's hard, isn't it? You try and move your ring finger and keep every other finger not moving. Okay. That difficulty you're having, now multiply it by 100, and that's what a patient with stroke feels. All right? Anyway, this apparatus allows you to quantify that ability, and you can put it into an MRI scanner. So you can actually look at the way the brain changes over time as this individuation comes back. All right? And again, individuation, again, this is a busy graph, but again, you can see the black circles below. You've got a similar time course of recovery of your hand after stroke, where most of it's happening. Again, the biggest jumps are happening over the first week to 3 months. All right? So, how are we going to go after this in a little bit more detail? I've shown you ways with imaging and with quantification of movement in humans, but we're going to switch a moment to the mouse. All right? And what I like to say at talks like this, that if in 2015 you have a stroke, hope that you're a mouse or a rat, because you'll get better care. All right? Now, this is just a slide showing why there's some homology between prehension. What is prehension? It's the ability to reach and grasp between mouse and man. Okay. So let's give you an example of that, and I hope you can all see this mouse. And mice would much prefer just to put their head in the plate, so you actually have to create an apparatus. But see, it wanted to use its tongue. But look at, I bet you didn't know that mice have little hands like that, did you? Look at that. And this is at the beginning. Look at it trying to grab that pellet. All right? So these mice are very impressive, little prehensors. Right? And then, of course, we're so impressed that we give them a stroke. Right? So this is a mouse brain, and basically there's a way of inducing a stroke in its cortex by blocking a vessel. And this is what's happening. You can see on the right that there's a blood vessel with a cutoff on it. Basically, the region beyond that cutoff is now infarcted. Okay? And this is just showing you the mouse brain, in cross-section. And we're going to zero in on the stroke, which is that black hole there, and that's the mouse equivalent of motor cortex, and motor cortex is the cortical region of your brain that controls the contralateral side of your body. Okay? And as I showed you those strokes at the very beginning, that basically you can interrupt the neural cables anywhere from the cortex, where the control signal comes from, all the way down its course into the spinal cord. And the key point is that anywhere along that way you'll get this hemiparesis, this loss of motor control and strength on the other side of your body. Okay, so we can give these mice a punctate stroke. So all you're seeing here is we're training the mice on that pellet task that I showed you the video for before we give it a stroke. Okay, it's a slightly different experimental paradigm. We can't do that with humans, right? I can't say, look, I'm going to teach you how to play golf for a couple of weeks or months, and then wait for you to have a stroke and then see what your golf is like. Okay? You're not going to get that past an institutional review board. All right? But in mice, you can do it. All right? So basically, what you're seeing is the mice getting better and better at reaching through dexterously and grabbing that pellet, and the number just says that they reach 60% efficacy. They never manage, if you give them 30 pellets in a row, to grab every single one in one go and get into its mouth. It's too difficult. They kind of plateau around 60%. All right? And then where the big red arrow is, that's the time point after about 10 days of training where we give them the stroke. And then they plummet in a bit. Obviously, they have a stroke. Okay? And then what we do is we say, time to give the mouse rehabilitation. All right? Now, we wait about a week to give this mouse treatment. So it gets put back in its cage, it gets fed. It's basically, we try and sort of reproduce this 60% alone, 85% of the time not moving environment that I complained about at the beginning of the talk, and we make that be the week after the stroke. And then we start training it, far more, by the way, than humans get on the same task. So we're very much egging the pudding, where it's a task it's already been trained on. We're going to give it a lot of training on this task. All we've done is waited a week before we start training it. And you see that it gets a little bit better, and it just never gets better. So even though it's got 3 weeks of training just on this task, it just flatlines. Very similar to what I was saying in the chronic stroke patients 6 months out or more, where the robots and the constraint-induced therapy don't seem to be having much of an impact. In a mouse, it seems like it's already not much of an impact after a week. All right? But what about if we don't wait a week? What about if we pounce on them within 24 hours? And this is just a control group, don't worry about that. So we're going to now not wait a week, we're going to train them up again, we're going to give them the stroke, and they go back to normal. All right. So the only difference is we didn't wait. All right. All right. So there seems to be a sensitive period where you're going to get most of your bang for your buck for your training. All right? And there you are doing really well. You delay, you don't get as far. All right? So we know this. We've shown this now in our results. Why isn't anything being done? All right? And we will begin to explain why. To really, really freak you out, I'm going to show you something that I think makes it pretty compelling, what I'm saying. So there's this mouse. I've given it a stroke. I waited a week to sort of be analogous to what happens to humans. And as you see again, we train it, but we can't get it to budge back to where it was before. Okay? Now, how would you get them back? In other words, we didn't start training them within the 24 hours to get that lovely result I just showed you. I've waited a week, and they're not budging. I'm training them, and I just can't get them to budge. What would you do to try and cure them? Give them another stroke. Perfect treatment. Can you imagine getting away with that? So what we did is exactly that. We gave them another stroke in the same region. And sure enough, they get worse. So you'll see the line dip, and they got back to normal. Okay. I mean, this is shocking. Right? It means that there's something about a stroke that creates an environment that is unique and therefore makes you susceptible to training effects. And you can actually reset this sensitive period with another stroke. Now, this is great for science fiction. You could imagine, you know, I want to be really good at kung fu, but I'm going to have a little stroke, but I'll live with it because then I can be trained. So I actually, when I was in New York giving a talk at the Rubin Museum, a film director came up to me and said, you know, I'd really like to make a movie about that idea. And I said, well, I have to have some cut of that if we're going to do that. But anyway, obviously, I am not going to, at Johns Hopkins or anywhere else, put in a request to give patients another stroke. All right, so that's obviously out of the question. But this is just as proof of concept, is what could we do to get the benefits of the stroke, the second one, without any of the downside? Okay. Well, before I get to the answer to that, I just want you to see the model that we're building here, which is that, oops, let's prevent that in a minute. So the normal brain has normal plasticity, and you all learn, and learning for all of us suffers from the curse of task specificity. Okay, you learn how to play the piano, you do not become a better shoelace tire. All right? It's actually a real mystery, which our lab is studying, and I don't have time to talk about obviously today, is why is learning so task specific? Right? We don't really know the answer to that question. After chronic stroke, where all the studies are done, your learning mechanism is just like ours. It's just you've got a hole in your head now. So normal learning after stroke, task specificity, compensation, no reversal. Spontaneous biological recovery that obeys that 70% rule, which happens early, everything gets better. When you have that spontaneous recovery, you don't just get using a spoon back and not a fork. All right? So there's something special, as I think I've been able to persuade you, about this early period where you get damage to the brain and plasticity is revved up really high. And I've shown you that that's short-lived, and it can be reproduced by inducing it again with a stroke. So how do we exploit this sensitive period? Well, could drugs maybe prolong it or induce it? Could brain stimulation do it? Could we enhance the environment, make things more motivating? And we'll talk about that too. So fluoxetine, you probably all know it as Prozac, is an SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is used for depression. But there's been a lot of work in animal models suggesting that Prozac and drugs like it have potentiating effects on plasticity. And there was a study, it's that second one down, called the FLAME study. You see in FLAME in parentheses. That was a study where patients were given Prozac within about a week after their stroke, and they continued the Prozac for 3 months, and lo and behold, they did better on an impairment measure, not just a compensation measure. This study was done right. They looked at the right kind of measure. They looked early. Why was it done? You know the answer to that. All you need to do is pop that pill every day, right? So that kind of research gets done. Right? It's not robots and therapists and brain stimulation, all that labor-intensive stuff. Pop the pill. Right? Not enough. So what about now going in the opposite direction in the translational pipeline? And please, again, heed my advice. The human work led the animal work in this case, because we're now going from the FLAME study, which admittedly there were animal studies looking at Prozac, but now we reproduced the FLAME study in the mouse. All right? So we did the same as before. We train them on this reaching task. We give them a stroke, and then we wait a week. But in one set of animals, we give them Prozac the day after their stroke. Even though we delay them for a week like the other group, they've got Prozac on board. Okay? So even back to normal. So here, we've waited a week, which I've told you doesn't work anymore. But here, somehow, having the drug on board sustained your receptivity to the training, even though we waited a week. That's really good news, right? It means that if you're very sick, many times a year, I look after stroke patients in the neuro-intensive care unit and the stroke unit at Hopkins. Patients can be very ill. They may not be able to start training right away. This may be a way to keep this sensitive period open. That's the result of the FLAME study. We won't talk about that now. Now I'm going to tell you about brain stimulation. So what about enhancing plasticity through stimulation over the cortex? So this is a study that we did now back in 2009, where we wanted to have a look at skill learning in healthy people with a difficult task using the hand, and we wanted to see that if we stimulated the motor cortex on the opposite side, whether we could turn normal young people into super learners. All right? So this is quite a difficult task, and again, I can't demonstrate it, but you basically have to take that black square on the left near the home bar, and you have to move it to the red gates without overflowing, come back, go out to the blue 2 gates, back to the 3 gates and 4, and then stop at home, and you can't overshoot any of the gates. You have to get right between the 2 colored bars per gate. It's very difficult, and the way you move is you have to squeeze a force transducer that you see on the left, and the force you apply dictates how far the cursor moves along the x-axis, but we're nasty. We apply a function that is nonlinear, so in fact, it's not just simply scaling. You have to learn the mapping between the force you apply at different levels of force to move the cursor. All right? If any of you did it like I did, I just said it's impossible, can't be done. Right? I got irritated. But you do, right? It's like skiing, it's like golf, you just don't think it's possible, and then the days go by and you improve. Same here. But then what we did is we located the spot on the brain that controls the muscles of the hand you're using something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Once that location was identified, we then put essentially what's called a battery, transcranial direct current stimulation it's called, and essentially it's just a 12-volt battery on your head which can induce small currents in the neurons in your cortex, and you basically have this battery on, the anode, over the location that we identified previously with the transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then you basically have that battery on, you don't even realize it, while you practice over days. All right, so one group gets it, the other group don't, and then you see whether you've enhanced the amount of improvement you get per trial of practice, just like you enhance the amount of improvement you get per trial of rehab early versus late after stroke. Okay, so that's the parallel. Can we induce a state of plasticity in healthy people just through brain stimulation that is somehow a mimic of what we think stroke is doing? Right? I've already said we can't give people strokes, but we can give them Prozac. Maybe we can give them brain stimulation. Right? And I wouldn't be showing you this unless you didn't turn people into super learners. So basically, the people in gray got 40 to 50% better than the people in black just by having stimulation of their motor cortex. Now, when we submitted this paper for publication, one of the editors was somewhat concerned ethically about turning normal people into super learners just by stimulating their motor cortex. I mean, can you imagine the Tour de France where you can at least you could test the urine? How are you going to test if somebody had a battery on their head beforehand? Right? So, of course, I got irritated again because I wasn't doing this to win the Tour de France. I was doing this because we thought ultimately this might be therapeutically useful. Right. Now, everything I'm telling you is for a reason, okay? So we're moving towards the denouement here, but I hope you keep in your head brain stimulation, Prozac, early period, etc. Okay. A colleague of mine, a very famous motor control researcher called Daniel Wolpert and his team, wanted to see what happens when all of us in a normal 24 to 48 hour period move. And it turns out that most of our time for our arms, We spend our movements, whether you're eating with a knife and fork, you're at your computer, you're gesturing excessively like I am, but you essentially live in this statistical bubble of movements that have the kind of shape you see there in red and green. So in other words, you're living in that space, that cloud of movements, despite doing very different tasks that overlap in that cloud. Is that clear? So that's your sort of everyday movement space. All right? Keep that in your heads. Because now we're going to get to why it's better to be a mouse or a rat than a human when you have your stroke, because unlike the humans who are alone in their room like a cage, rats get put in with their friends, with toys, with wheels, with pulleys. It's called an enriched environment. Okay? It's like a playground, and there's a lot of nice data to show that in an enriched, stimulating, playful, exploratory environment, brain plasticity is heightened. Okay, so you've heard that stroke can do it, brain stimulation can do it, Prozac can do it, and sheer fun can do it. All right. So now, here's my question to all of you. You've learned all these components. How would you now take all these pieces that I've given you? You have to go early. It has to be fun. You have to stimulate the brain's plasticity. You're beginning, I know, I can detect it. You're beginning to come up with, I know what I would do if I were in charge of rehabilitation, right? So that's SMARTS 2, right? That's basically the trial that we've started, and it's bloody difficult, I have to tell you, all right, to do this kind of trial that I'm about to describe to you. Even though I think unequivocally it's what needs to be done, you'll begin to understand why it hasn't been done. So here's the standard environment that I showed you before. Alone, inactive, bored. And what we really need, obviously, is for you to turn into a dolphin. All right? With a robot, while you're having your brain stimulated. That's obvious, right? I know you all knew that. So that's me. It was a good picture. I just want you to get the idea of the scope and the scale of the immersion. So there you are in a robot with a beautiful, immersive, blue, ocean-like feel, and you become, and that's Bandit. You see that? All right. So I'm now going to show you what this is, all right? So let me just give you a little bit more explanation than I have, just so you're not going, dolphin, what? What's he talking about? We spent 2 years at the National Aquarium that's based in Baltimore studying dolphins with that Carter team that I told you about, with that dolphin symbol. And that Carter team is made up of Kat McNally, the artist, animation artist, and then 3 others, Omar Ahmad, who's a computer scientist and worked at Disney for a while before he joined us. Pramit Roy, who is a programmer and who was most valued programmer at Microsoft for many years. And then Kevin Olds, who did his PhD in robotics at Hopkins. And as you can hear, what Disney, gamers, Microsoft, programming, artists, what's that got to do with medicine? Everything. Okay, that is what you need. You need basically the Pixarification, the Silicon Valley mentality, and you have to inject it into the archaic world of medicine. All right? And what were we thinking? Well, dolphins, people love dolphins. Why? People love dolphins because they think they're so intelligent. Why do people think dolphins are so intelligent? Have they ever had a conversation with them? No. Right? Is it because you've been told? Most of the time. People say that dolphins are really intelligent, but if you had to decide if a dolphin was very intelligent, how would you decide it? Well, you sort of can tell, right? They play. They seem to enjoy their unbelievable prowess. They play in the water. You never see a hammerhead shark playing, right? Your goldfish doesn't suddenly do a loop-the-loop, right? Whereas dolphins do, right? So dolphins are injecting their cognitive capacity into their movements. Well, that's what we all are obsessed with, right? We pay our athletes more than anyone else in the world. We love car chases, kung fu movies, roller coasters, ballet. We watch grown men throw balls around. Have you ever asked yourself why? That we spend so much of our cognitive time watching people throwing a ball around? I mean, if an alien came down from outer space, they'd think we were mad, right? But it's not mad, because we understand there's something unique about the link between cognition and movement, and we are moving organisms, okay? So, how do you now make somebody experience the sheer joy of movement again after brain injury and make them make movements that occupy that bubble that I showed you that people live in, right? So we wanted to short-circuit task specificity by simply having people be a dolphin that they control with their arms in such a way that they're swimming about so gloriously that they're not aware that they're traversing that whole statistical bubble that will be useful for all movements. Does that make sense? So we're basically trying to bring together play, movement, immersion, embodiment, and that was the sort of mandate. All right? So now I'll show you what the trial looks like. So I think I need to exit this and go to our movie. And I'm going to show you, now what you're going to see now is very close, and we'll turn the lights down here, to the interface that patients currently are experiencing in the trial. So you have to be in this trial, you have to be within 5 weeks of your stroke. If you're beyond 5 weeks, you're not eligible. And then you get randomized to normal therapy in that period, dolphin therapy, or dolphin therapy plus that transcranial direct current stimulation of your motor cortex as well. So it's normal therapy in this time window, which is already more than people usually get, in this immersive gaming environment with the robot, or the immersive gaming environment plus the robot plus brain stimulation. And you do that for 2 hours a day, an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, 5 days a week for 3 weeks, within 5 weeks of your stroke. Is that clear? So it's unprecedented amount of dose and intensity that current rehabilitation facilities simply could not afford. Because you'd need to have the roboticist, you'd have to have the robot, you'd have to have the game, you'd have to have the therapist. And without the therapist, by the way, this is not substituting for therapists. They are integral to this. Right? They're there every minute. All right. This animation is so new that the president of Disney and Pixar came to visit the lab to see this, because this is simulation, not animation. And as you could see, the dolphin ate the shark at the end, which happens all the time in oceans. Right. Now I'll show you some patients doing this. These were patients that very kindly agreed to be pilot patients before the trial started. So this is all a little bit science labby. It's not all beautified yet because we were running patients through. And these were fundamentally important point here. These are patients with chronic stroke. Okay, so these are patients who would not be eligible for the acute trial. Now, what made this both inspiring and difficult for me and the rest of the team is that they all said, why can't we have this? Because they don't want to be told they're outside this window and they're not going to respond anymore. And to be honest, having seen the patients do this, I don't know if that's completely true. It could be that There are a subset of patients who are outside the window we've discovered who might still have a latent capacity to improve, who might, for example, with Prozac on board, improve, who might with brain stimulation improve. So the number of people who might benefit from something much more immersive and gaming and beauty, I mean, after all, what we're talking about here is to make people actually enjoy being sick. Now, I see it sounds like an oxymoron because we're so puritanical, but if you're going to be ill, why not have a great time? Right? So another thing that we're beginning to think is ways to offer this immersive experience to other patients. And before I show you the last video, I should say that many of you may have heard of this company called Lumosity and other such things where essentially you play these games online to try and improve your memory. Well, you heard it from me, and I know this is being filmed. It's all nonsense. All right? Why is it nonsense? It's nonsense because it suffers from the curse of task specificity. You get better at the particular game you're playing. It doesn't generalize. Okay. I was on a NPR radio station about a year ago, and a woman called in. I thought it was a friend, a spoof, calling in, because I thought this was too well placed. And the woman says, you know, I'm in a nursing home, and I just like to have really interesting conversations with my friends and read novels. But maybe I should be playing these games. I said, oh, ma'am, please don't. All right. Why am I telling you this? Well, because there are studies now, some from colleagues at Princeton, who have shown that if you want to improve your cognition, for example, your working memory, the best way to do it thus far is to exercise. So what seems to be the case is that movement is the way to actually improve what seemingly are unrelated cognitive capacities. Right? It's this indirect approach. So if it's true that the reason why we're obsessed with movement is because we understand something that maybe the rest of the scientists have not understood, which is movement is the key to cognition and mental health, well, then that means that this kind of experience might be beneficial to people who haven't even had their motor system damaged.